The general leaned back in his chair with the kind of posture that suggested decades of authority. The kind that came from command rooms, quiet orders, and consequences that never made headlines. And when he looked at the young man across the table, he allowed himself a faint smile. The kind that often preceded a joke, because to him the setting was informal. A charity dinner with veterans and families. A place where rank was symbolic and stories flowed easily. And so when he glanced at the man's name badge and saw the words, "Single Dad," printed beneath his name, he raised an eyebrow and asked lightly whether that title came with a service record or if it was simply life's way of issuing medals without ceremony. And a few people nearby chuckled softly because it sounded harmless, friendly even, but the man did not laugh. Instead he straightened slightly, not in offense but in habit, as if his body recognized the tone of a superior, even when his mind knew he was no longer under anyone's command. And he answered calmly that he had served, not with banners or parades, but with nights that never ended and mornings that came too fast. And the general smiled wider, expecting a witty comeback. Yet something in the man's eyes suggested that the answer was not finished, so he waited. And the man continued by saying that he had served in places where maps stopped being accurate and time lost its meaning, where silence was louder than gunfire and decisions were measured not in minutes but in heartbeats. And the surrounding conversation slowly faded as people sensed a shift, because the man's voice was steady but carried weight, the kind that presses against the chest rather than the ears. And he explained that he had been part of units that did not exist on paper, missions that were never briefed to families, and operations that were only acknowledged by absence. And the general's smile began to soften, then falter, because this was no longer banter. And the man went on to say that when he came home, he did not come back to applause or uniforms, but to a quiet house that felt foreign, because the person who had once waited for him no longer could. And suddenly the meaning of single dad shifted in the room. No longer a casual descriptor, but a title earned through loss. And the general felt a tightening in his chest as the man explained that his service did not end when he left the field, because it simply changed form, turning into sleepless nights beside a crib, learning to read fear in a child's breath, the same way he once read danger in shadows, and teaching himself tenderness with the same discipline he once applied to survival. And the man said he never listed his rank, because it felt irrelevant compared to the responsibility of raising a child who would never know the other parent except through stories carefully chosen to protect innocence. And the general's hands, which had signed orders that altered lives, now rested still, because he realized that his question, meant as humor, had brushed against something sacred, something forged in silence. And the man continued not to accuse, but to explain, saying that service was not always about who you fought for, but who you kept alive afterward, and that medals rust while memory doesn't. And as he spoke, the general saw not a civilian, but a soldier whose battlefield had followed him home. And the apology formed before the explanation finished, because respect does not wait for full understanding. And the general said quietly that he was sorry, not for the question itself, but for the ease with which he had asked it, for forgetting that some titles carry more weight than stars. And the man nodded, accepting the apology without ceremony, because he did not seek recognition, only truth. And as the room slowly returned to sound, the general remained silent, reflecting on how leadership often teaches command but not humility, and how a single answer, given without anger, can reveal the limits of rank. And in that moment, the general understood that service is not diminished by leaving the uniform behind, nor is sacrifice measured by visibility. And the title single dad now echoed louder in his mind than any rank insignia he had ever worn, because it represented endurance without audience, courage without command, and love without backup. And the realization lingered long after the conversation ended, settling into him like a lesson learned too late, but not wasted. Because true respect begins where assumptions end. And sometimes the bravest soldiers are the ones who carry their battles quietly into ordinary days, never asking to be seen, yet deserving of the deepest salute. After that evening, the general found himself thinking about the exchange more often than he expected. Not because it had embarrassed him in front of others, but because it had quietly unsettled beliefs he had carried for years. Beliefs shaped by formal doctrine and ceremonial respect. And as days passed, he replayed the man's words in his mind while reviewing reports, attending briefings, and shaking hands with officials who spoke fluently about sacrifice without ever having to define it. And the contrast grew sharper each time. Because the single dad had not spoken with drama or bitterness, but with a calm precision that suggested a life where emotion had been mastered rather than avoided. And the general began to realize that such mastery does not come from command schools or leadership manuals, but from repeated exposure to loss without surrender. And this realization followed him into a base visit where young officers stood straight and attentive, their futures still unscarred, and he wondered how many of them would someday wear invisible titles heavier than their rank. Titles like widower, guardian, survivor, or parent forged in the aftermath of service. And during a pause in the visit, he surprised himself by asking one of the officers about life beyond deployment rather than about readiness. And the question lingered awkwardly because it was rarely asked. And that awkwardness itself felt revealing. Because institutions often prepare people for battle but not for return. And the general understood that the single dad's story was not unique, but simply rarely heard. Hidden behind ordinary labels that civilians and leaders alike overlook. And meanwhile the man continued his own routine. Waking before dawn to prepare lunches, double-checking homework, tying shoes with hands that once dismantled weapons in darkness. And each morning he measured success not by mission completion, but by whether his child smiled before school. Because joy had become his new objective. And yet the habits of vigilance never fully left him, as he still scanned rooms instinctively, positioned himself between his child and strangers, and listened to silence with trained attention. And though he never spoke of it openly, he carried the quiet understanding that peace is fragile and must be protected through presence. And sometimes at night when the house was finally still, he allowed memory to surface. Not the violence itself, but the faces, the promises made before departure. The last conversation that now replayed endlessly. And he would steady himself the way he always had, by acknowledging the pain without letting it dictate his next action. Because his child needed consistency more than explanation. And weeks later, fate placed the general and the man in the same room again. This time at a smaller event without crowds or speeches. And the general recognized him immediately. Not by name but by bearing, and approached without humor or rank. Simply as one human acknowledging another. And he thanked him for the honesty of his answer that night, admitting that it had reshaped his understanding of service. And the man listened without interruption, because listening had become second nature to him. And when the general finished, he said that understanding was not necessary for respect, but that reflection was rare, and that alone mattered. And they spoke quietly about transitions, about how leaving a unit feels like losing a language, and how parenthood introduces a different kind of fear, one that cannot be trained away. And the general admitted that leadership often shields itself behind formality, while the man noted that informality can hide deep wounds. And in that exchange something equal formed, not friendship but mutual recognition. And the general later carried that recognition into policy discussions, advocating for better support systems for families who bear the aftermath of classified service. Though he never mentioned the source of his conviction, because lessons of that kind are not claimed but absorbed. And the man continued to move through the world unmarked by symbols. Attending school meetings instead of reunions. Building a future measured in birthdays rather than anniversaries. And as his child grew older, questions naturally emerged, careful at first, then more direct. And he answered them honestly, but gently, choosing truth without burden, teaching that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to remain kind despite it. And one day his child proudly told a teacher that their parent was a hero, not because of stories heard, but because of actions witnessed daily. And the man smiled at that, because it meant more than any commendation. And elsewhere the general stood at another podium, delivering another speech. But this time his words carried restraint, humility, and acknowledgement of unseen service. And those listening felt it without knowing why. Because authenticity resonates even when its origins are invisible. And in that way a single question asked as a joke had quietly altered two lives. One by revealing depth, the other by awakening perspective. Proving that respect is not commanded by rank nor demanded by sacrifice, but earned through the willingness to listen when the answer is more than expected. And the echo of that answer continued to shape choices long after the room had emptied, reminding both men that true service often begins after the uniform comes off and continues in the quiet discipline of showing up every day for those who depend on you most. Time continued its steady march, indifferent to rank, memory, or reflection. And yet, both the general and the single dad found that the moment they had shared lingered in subtle ways, shaping decisions and reactions long after its initial impact had faded from conscious thought. Because moments rooted in truth do not demand attention, they quietly alter direction. And for the general this alteration became evident in how he now observed people. No longer scanning rooms solely for posture or protocol, but for the quieter signals of endurance. The slightly delayed smile, the practiced calm, the eyes that had learned to measure risk without appearing alert. And he began to notice how many carried invisible histories beneath ordinary titles. How many navigated civilian life with the same discipline once reserved for operations. And this awareness changed his leadership in ways that could not be summarized in reports, as he found himself advocating not just for readiness, but for recovery. Not just for deployment efficiency, but for reintegration dignity. Understanding now that the end of service on paper rarely aligns with its end in reality. And meanwhile, the single dad moved deeper into a life, defined by responsibility that allowed no rehearsal and offered no debrief. Where mistakes mattered differently and victories were quiet and cumulative. And he learned that raising a child alone required a form of courage distinct from combat. Because there was no enemy to confront directly, only uncertainty to manage patiently, and he discovered that love, unlike fear, does not sharpen instincts but softens them, demanding constant recalibration of habits once built for survival. And as years passed, he watched his child grow into curiosity, resilience, and humor. Traits that mirrored the best parts of the life that had been lost, and the discipline that had remained. And sometimes he wondered whether the balance he struck between protection and freedom was correct, whether he hovered too closely or stepped back too far. But he trusted the same internal compass that had guided him through darkness before, knowing that doubt was not weakness but evidence of care. And occasionally the past resurfaced unexpectedly, in the sound of distant thunder, in the weight of certain silences, in the way anniversaries arrived without warning. And on those days he allowed himself to pause, to remember fully, because forgetting felt like betrayal. Yet he also understood that living well was its own form of honor. And elsewhere the general faced retirement, the gradual relinquishing of authority that had once defined his identity, and he found the transition disorienting. Because without schedules and salutes the question of purpose returned unfiltered. And it was then that he truly understood the single dad's earlier words about service changing shape rather than ending. Because he too had to learn how to exist without insignia, how to contribute without command, and he volunteered his time mentoring young leaders. Not by recounting victories but by emphasizing humility, adaptability, and the importance of listening beyond assumptions. And sometimes he told a version of the story without names or details, describing a moment when a simple question revealed the limits of rank. And those listening felt the lesson, even if they never knew its source. And years later, their paths crossed one final time. Not at an event or ceremony, but by coincidence. In a quiet public place where neither expected recognition. And age had softened them both, lines earned through responsibility rather than regret. And they exchanged brief words, updates shared without elaboration. And the general learned that the child was thriving, confident, and compassionate, while the single dad learned that the general had found fulfillment beyond uniform. And there was no need to revisit the past conversation, because its meaning had already been lived out. And as they parted, there was no salute, no apology, only mutual acknowledgement. Because respect no longer needed articulation, and afterward each carried on. One returning to family, the other to reflection. And the world around them continued unchanged, unaware of the quiet exchange that had once unfolded years before. Yet its influence remained woven into choices made and values upheld. And in that sense, the story had never been about embarrassment or apology, but about recognition. About how easily depth can be overlooked when wrapped in ordinary language. And how a title like Single Dad can contain histories of courage, loss, discipline, and love far greater than those suggested by formal rank. And ultimately the lesson endured not as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady reminder that the most meaningful service often leaves no visible trace. That leadership is measured not by authority exercised, but by understanding gained. And that the strongest people are often those who carry their past without displaying it, shaping the future quietly through presence, responsibility, and the unspoken commitment to keep going for the sake of someone else every single day.